Hello and welcome back to another Exos hero video, and today we're going to do a top 10 tier list focusing on legendary backline heroes. So this is going to cover the defenders as well as the supports. We're going to point out the top 10 heroes that we think are the best in today's situation, and then we'll talk a little bit more about why we think the rest of the heroes didn't make it into the top 10. So to start out with, let's talk about number 10 and number 9 together, and both of them are going to be supports. And this is going to be Corinne and Ledger.
So now, if you guys watched our last legendary support tier list for season 1, you might be thinking, wait, I thought Corinne was actually pretty good there. Why is she last place on this list? And the reason why both of these healers are so low on this list is, honestly, healers kind of fell out of favor once Dorka got introduced. As we mentioned in our Dorka Hero Spotlight, and as you guys have probably picked up by now just playing the game, Dorka is insane. Her healing is better than basically every other healer in the game. There's only one that stands out, and we'll mention her later on in the list. But when it comes to Ledger and Corinne, the healing is not as good as Dorka. The only thing they provide is the revive, which is why they still have a spot in the top 10, as we think revive is very useful utility in PvE. In PvP content, less so, because you'll probably get bursted down. As a healer, you're always a priority target, so there's definitely things to worry about there. As far as damage goes, Corinne has a 3 mana single target ability on her A1 that does some healing. This will do decent damage with Signature Force considering her base attack isn't high. She actually benefits a bit from the flat mana scaling damage that elemental damage provides. Ledger is the same way with her 5 mana cost AoE A2. So the damage potential for both of these heroes is there, and the revive utility is also part of what makes them valuable. But ultimately, that's all they have, and that's why they both sit at number 10 and 9 respectively on our list.
Yeah, I agree. And moving on to our numbers 8 and number 7, we have a couple of defenders here, and that's going to be Nika and Guder. So again, if you guys remember the last legendary tier list we did, we had Nika and Guder pretty low on the list when it comes to defenders. But I think since the start of Season 2, especially with the introduction of Signature Force and elemental damage, we do think some of these damage-heavy defenders actually have more of a role to play in today's meta. Both Nika and Guder, our criticism for them back in Season 1 was the fact that neither of them bring too much CC, and utility-wise in terms of defender, they're not that great either at keeping your team alive. However, currently, with the addition of elemental damage, we do think they can become that secondary damage dealer for you, either in PvP or PvE situation. So let's take a look at Nika real quick. So both of these heroes have relatively okay speed at around 70, so they're not super slow, but they're definitely not very fast, so don't rely on them as your primary damage dealer. But at 70 speed, if we look at Nika, 2 mana single target A1 is decent, provides a little bit of CC, which is nice to have. And then she is more of an AoE damage threat with an A2 that has 4 mana requirement and does 204% damage to all enemy. So the base damage isn't high, but at 4 mana it scales quite well with elemental damage, so it definitely becomes a solid cleanup damage source for you, especially if you think about setting up a team with fast AoE damage dealers to open up at the beginning of the round. By the time Nika gets her turn, she will have the ability to clean up the backline threat on the opposing team. On the other hand, you have Guder, very similar to Nika, has a low mana A1 that does a little bit of CC, which is good. On the other hand, Guder is almost like the Exos hero's version of the Hulk. He just goes in and smashes whatever is in front of him. So with his A2, 5 mana requirement, 840% base damage, and on top of that you add in the elemental damage that you can potentially have. This is essentially going to kill anyone. So whether it's a straggler on the opposing team that you really want to finish off, or it's one of those pesky frontline heroes that you want to take out like a Garth, this skill can potentially help you get rid of them quite easily. So overall, we think, while their kit didn't change all that much, and they still don't bring a lot of defensive utility to them, the potential of damage is what's boosting them higher on the tier list now compared to Season 1. And we do think, as a secondary damage dealer, there's a role for them to play in Season 2 now. But now, with that, let's move on to our next on the list, which is number 6, Alexi.
So if you guys have watched our Season 1 Legendary Defender tier list, you'll know that Alexi was somewhere in the middle of our list, and we thought he was underrated. We think that the same is still the case today. He's in the middle of our list, and we still think that he's underrated. Like we've been mentioning throughout this video, Signature Force has been a big part of what changed some of these rankings, and it's actually a big part of what keeps Alexi in the middle here. Specifically around his A2, Perpetual Snow, 4 mana, deals 120 to all back row enemies, and freezes for 6 turns. So the 120 damage isn't important because as a defender, his base attack is low, 120 scaling is also low. That's never been the point. Before, it was all about setting up that CC and giving his team space to move. But now, because you have flat damage that scales off mana through Signature Force, he's actually a damage threat as well as providing that CC. And we think that this gives him a lot of flexibility in terms of having a 1 mana single target A1 and an AoE A2, and then also having some CC along with it. So Alexi really didn't change as much in his ranking because he didn't change as much as a hero. All he's received is some extra damage, but functionally we think that he plays the same role in the team of maybe cleaning up at the end, supporting your team with a little bit of CC and locking down their backline. But other than that, he's really the same old Uncle Alexi we all know and love, with a 2.5 community rating. So we're going to keep saying he's underrated until that boosts at least up to a 3, so that might be a while. But while we're waiting for that, why don't we talk about number 5, who is Lingan.
Yeah, so with number 5 we have Lingan, and frankly, in our opinion, Lingan is probably the biggest beneficiary of Signature Force when it comes to legendary defenders. And prior to Season 2, we talked about Lingan and the fact that he just had a very incoherent kit. If you look at his kit, a lot of what he does is about doing damage, right? A1 does single target damage with a little bit of CC, and his A2 does 240% damage to all back row heroes. So a lot of what he does is all about doing that damage, but his damage just wasn't that good because his base attack was super low as a defender. But now, again, similar to Guder and Nika, with the introduction of elemental damage and pretty nice mana scaling, especially with her A2 at 4 mana, she becomes a very potent damage threat for you, and at the speed of around 70, she's actually decently fast. So as that secondary damage dealer, I think there's definitely a role for her in the game at this point. But what puts her ahead of Guder and Nika, you might be asking? And that's really because of the Fate Core, right? With the Fate Core, Lingan receives the Barrier of Will passive, which gives her just that a little bit of survivability that Guder and Nika doesn't quite have. Lingan is already a pretty solid defender with pretty high base defense, so it's hard to take him down. Now you add on the Barrier of Will, he's definitely going to be able to survive the first round of burst, and that guarantees that he'll survive long enough to put out his own damage and potentially cleaning up the opposing team. So overall, similar to Guder and Nika, as a secondary damage dealer, pretty good, especially if you have the Signature Force unlocked. And if you do have the Fate Core, then the added survivability also provides a little bit more value as well. So number 5, Lingan, in our opinion, pretty solid. But now let's move on to number 4 and we'll talk about Luke.
As we move into the top 4, these heroes are really going to separate themselves quite a distance from the bottom 6. And the reason for this is, even though with the bottom 6, we started noticing Signature Force, Awakening, these new mechanics have really shaken up the rankings, but for the top 4, it's still the same top 4, and the same was true for our backline video as well, because these heroes are just so good by themselves, anything you add onto them just becomes an extra bonus. And Luke has a lot of stuff added to him. Specifically, let's talk about his Fate Core. So he's part of the Banga family. Being a defender, this is really important because Heart Strike is a huge source of damage and utility that defenders don't normally have. So in this case, he's going to get the minus 20 attack speed, he's going to decrease defense by 1000, he's going to be doing 2000 true damage per turn, and afflict the enemy with blind. I mean, this is such a big deal. And he got a core reverse relatively recently, Ultimate Sacrifice, which allows him, when he has a positive effect, a recovery, some sort of buff, then he gets this Ultimate Sacrifice mark, and then if he uses Share Health, all of the damage his allies with Share Health take get transferred to him. All of it. Basic attacks, skills, elemental damage, he takes all of that damage. Which, at first, when I heard this description, I was like, this is terrible because he's just going to die. But there's actually a couple instances in both PvP and PvE where this niche can actually come in handy. For instance, you know you're about to take a big AoE, you just have Luke share health before, and then he'll take all of that damage and just enable your team to clean up afterwards. So he's able to create a lot of space for the team now and fulfill his role as a true defender, while also, with his A1 being a dot, he procs Heart Strike well by himself, and he has elemental damage, scaling off the 2 mana single target. It's not the best, but it's decent damage for a defender, and that's what Luke excels at. So that's why he's at number 4. As we move up this list, we'll start talking about some defenders that are maybe a little bit better, as well as the one healer that could rival Dorka.
Alright, so moving into our number 3, we have yet another defender, and this is Degas. So we think Degas and Luke are really similar in many ways. Both of them have that complete package when it comes to being a defender, right? Block 2 passive is really good at keeping your team alive, providing that provoke CC, and Degas A1 allows him to do the share health with all allies and boosts his own health by 38% for 8 turns. So a lot of great utilities here, and on top of that, if you do have his Fate Core, he also provides a Summer's Blessing passive, which helps you to block incoming frost damage for 1 turn, as well as providing a little bit of tech buff. So overall, he's very solid. What sets him apart is really his A2. First of all, unlike Luke, Degas brings a little bit more CC, which we think is really important. Right, with his A2 now, 5 mana requirement, he's able to freeze everyone on the opposing team for 5 turns. Given that he is pretty slow, this is not going to come in relatively early, but if he can get it off, that means by the time the second round comes around, the faster heroes on the opposing team, which are most likely to be their primary damage dealers, are all going to be frozen. That is amazing utility. And on top of that, the 5 mana requirement is quite good as well. If you can use this skill, especially if you do have elemental damage unlocked, this can actually do a decent amount of damage. If you have some of the heroes on the opposing team who are already low, this could be enough to kill them off. And if it doesn't, as we mentioned before, the amount of CC that you can bring with this is invaluable as well. You can lock them down and enable the rest of your team to clean up. So overall, we think Degas, while having a pretty solid set of defensive utilities, similar to Luke, his ability to do additional damage and CC puts him just slightly ahead of Luke at number 3 on our tier list. But now, let's move on to number 2, and that's gonna be Le Pen.
So now I'm going to be talking about my personal favorite healer, and that's going to be FC Le Pen. This is probably a lot of people's favorite healer until they get Dorka, but Le Pen still has a special place in my heart because she has a special place in everybody's team, and that is an amazing healer that provides amazing utility. So just look at her abilities for a second. Her A1, 2 mana, 187% damage to 1 enemy, with a heal over time for 4 turns, but who cares about that? The special is it resets the turn of the ally once every 6 turns, and that's the ally that gets healed. This is so good. I mean, there's already not that many heroes that get turn resets to begin with, so to have a hero that could give anybody a turn reset is so invaluable, and it's so important to have in PvE and PvP content. When we look at her A2, this is what I think all of the revivers should have had from the beginning, but since Le Pen has it, she's the one that stands out. And that is, after you revive a dead ally, they get damage immunity 1 time. So that's not just for the turn, but that's until they get hit again. This is really important because when you revive, your allies are going to be low HP and thus very, very vulnerable to either reset assassins like Jhin and Baraka, or heavy AoE. So in order to prevent them from just being revived and dying again, you have this damage immunity now, and honestly that's why Le Pen is the only relevant reviver in this game. And so combine these 2 special abilities on her actives with her Harbinger of Awakening, where she increases her own block to give her more survivability, she gets more attack speed, she gets damage immunity for 4 turns when she gets low. I mean, this is just such a good healer. She's defensive for herself, she's defensive for your team, and provides utility. It's just overall a great package to have in basically all content in the game. The only place we think she's not super effective is maybe high tier PvP, where again you have these speedy high damage heroes that might be able to burst her down along with some other targets in those initial turns. But other than that, she's an amazing pick, and that's why she's at number 2 on this list.
Alright, so with that, let's move into our number 1 on this list. And with no surprise, obviously, that's going to be Tantalo, and specifically FC Tantalo. The base Tantalo is pretty good. He covers all the basics that a top tier defender needs, whether it's CC, or block passive with provoke, or a little bit of debuff. So already the base Tantalo has amazing utility, but his fake core really just sets him apart and puts him among one of the best defender in the game, period. So let's take a look at why that is. So obviously as a Banga fake core, he comes in with the Heart Strike passive. Edward already covered about that when we talked about Luke, so I won't go into the detail again. But on top of the Heart Strike, additional damage and debuff that you get, he also gets a couple of unique passive. So first of all, he has the Overpower passive. With that, it decreases critical damage by 300%, and that's really, really good, right? It provides this safety net for your team. Whenever someone takes critical hit damage, they take 300% less from that critical hit, so that's really amazing. And right after one of your hero receives a critical hit, they also get the Swarm Friend passive applied to them as well, which allow them in that case to be immune to damage for one time until they get hit. So this is just such an amazing passive to have. Because as we mentioned before, we're really seeing with the introduction of elemental damage, a lot of teams are shifting towards this type of bursty, high crit, high damage type of team comp. And this is essentially one of the only way in the current game that kind of counters that playstyle because of the fact that you negate a lot of that critical hit and you provide additional damage immunity on top of that. It's just such a great way to keep your team alive. And that utility alone is amazing. And that's not to say the rest of his kit is bad too. His A1 does decent damage at 4 mana, so if you do have Signature Force unlocked with elemental damage, this can be quite significant amount of damage coming out on an AoE basis. And even if you don't, the utility this skill brings cannot be ignored either, right? It increases the attack of all allies by 13% of his own attacks. That's decent, not high, but pretty good. And it also increases block of all ally by 42 for 18 turns when this skill hits. 42 block is really a lot, and it really helps you to keep the team alive. And his A2 decreases the attack of the target by 35%, so all of that is really solid. And both of these skills also comes with damage over time as well, which really helps to level up the Heart Strike passive quickly. So overall, just a very, very coherent kit. Decent damage with a lot of utility and amazing unique passive that keeps your team alive from critical hits. So in today's game, Tantalo is by far one of the best defender in the game alongside of the likes of FC Shufraken or FC Garf, and absolutely deserves the #1 spot on our list. But with that, I'm gonna shift it back to Edward to talk about all the unfortunate souls that has been left out.
So, for context before we get started, you should know that this list was very hard to make, and by very hard to make, I mean it was hard to find 10 heroes that were good enough to be top 10. Obviously, in our top 4, those are some premier heroes, but honestly, beyond that, we were grasping at straws because the legendary, defender, and support roster just is not very strong in this game, and we don't think that Season 2 really made a difference there. Again, we have the same issues in the front line as we did with the bottom tier heroes in the back line as well, and that is low speed. If you have low speed, it's just so bad. I mean, you look at Tantalo, and his speed isn't amazing, but he covers for those weaknesses with a bunch of defensive utility, with damage, and so he brings something else to the table. But when you look at heroes like Fergie, Sibel, Minea, I mean, what do those heroes do? They provide buffs. And buffs, by the way, FC Genai is a thing, so those are just garbage. And so, when we think about it in this context, a lot of these heroes, they're too slow to have an impact fast, and the impact that they do have when it's their turn also requires some time, and it's delayed, or it's just not very strong, the potency is not strong. Supports and defenders typically don't have high attack scaling. Their mana scaling with elemental damage also isn't very high, because traditionally, you'd want low mana supports and defenders to be able to get the utility off early on without needing to generate mana. But now, again, with these elemental damage signature force season 2 changes, that's sort of gone out the window, and you want higher mana cost to take advantage of that damage. And so, we look at a lot of our heroes. The healers obviously got invalidated by Dorka, and a lot of the defenders have either made it on the list or just lack the damage and mana scaling to be able to do so, and that's why they didn't make it to top 10. It's a sad reality, but it's the one Exo Heroes lives in right now. We hope there will be some balance changes touching on heroes like Minea and Teria, Obelia to bring them more into the meta, but we doubt that's going to happen. So for now, just focus on those top 10. If you got our top 4, great. If you don't, then the top 10 are still serviceable for PvE and PvP content. That does it all for this list. We hope you found this video enjoyable or educational. If so, please leave us a like and subscribe. Comment below if you disagree with any of our rankings or if we said something bad about your waifu or husbando. Other than that, we do have more Exo Heroes content on the way, some Genshin Impact stuff as well, so keep an eye out for that. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.
Peace.